This was my favorite horror movie before I became a Stanley Kubrick stan, and The Shining ended up being my favorite horror movie, now one of my favorite movies of all time. But prior to that, I kind of had this, The Omen, and The Shining kind of all on the same level. I've seen this movie a lot, but it's been a while since I've seen it. So maybe this will retake the reins at number one, maybe fall to two. Definitely still going to be a top 10 no matter what. This is, I guess, the updated version that's 10 minutes longer than the original, 10 minutes or so longer than the original, with additional footage. I heard two commentary tracks for this film, and it seems like a lot of this stuff that was taken out wasn't necessarily anything that's groundbreaking, but I guess the director kind of regretted taking it out, so he added it back in this version. It could be just a money grab too. Um, Not as much backlash for the added scenes to this as for other films, but I guess this doesn't really have the cult following of like Star Wars, where if you mess with that, like the hardcore fans are gonna come at you. Despite this being like a hugely popular film and a hugely commercially successful film, I don't think it really has a cult following. Like the sequels didn't do extremely well. It's certainly better than a lot of other franchises like Hellraiser or Friday the 13th or Halloween. But those films have like cult followings and people are really into it. With this, I think some of the sequels are okay, but I don't think we really care about the sequels. It seems like just exorcism in general has become like a subcategory or subgenre in horror films rather than the Exorcist franchise becoming a big thing. It's like you have Friday the 13th and Halloween are both slashers, but it's not like, oh, Friday the 13th is slashers or Halloween are slashers. They're just franchises within that genre. This has just become a subgenre of its own, so it kind of hurts the brand of The Exorcist. I think Blumhouse recently purchased it for like a lot of money. And there was a new Exorcist film that came out maybe like a month ago or within a few weeks ago of me recording this, and it did really poorly. But there have been a lot of Exorcist films that have done extremely well. So while the brand isn't strong, what it introduced um, to the horror genre is extremely strong, and that's like exorcisms. Similar to Blair Witch, Blair Witch really popularized found footage, but the Blair Witch franchise didn't really become a huge thing. Found footage became a huge thing. In fact, like Paranormal Activity kind of took over, despite the fact that Blair Witch led the way for a film like Paranormal Activity. Yeah, it's weird how that worked out. And of all those films I mentioned, I think this is the best one by far of all of those. I guess the only argument you'd have is maybe the original Halloween, which I think is great as a low budget filmmaker, that something like that could be so successful, but it's not nearly as good as this. Max von Sydow, the great actor here, he was in another film, well, I spotlighted on my channel. He's using older makeup here. I think he was still fairly a young man. Definitely always had a mature face. The Seventh Seal, by the way, was the film I previously did. Film School podcast. No Rules Film School. So early on, they're obviously establishing the fact that he does have a heart condition, which does come into play later on in the film. So somewhat foreshadowing, setting up the characters. Poor health. Poor health also kind of in relation to his fight with this demon. I admire Max von Sydow as an actor, but he's one of those actors that I probably haven't watched as many of his films as I should have or would have liked to. But I think as I keep doing the podcasts and keep doing these commentary tracks, that I'm going to end up watching a lot more of his movies, and he's going to rise on my list of favorite actors. the more you examine films, I think the more you appreciate actors that choose good projects. Because I think one of the best actors I've ever watched maybe is kind of Denzel Washington, but he's nowhere near on my list of favorite actors because I don't really like any of his films. So I think as an actor, a lot that what makes you appreciate it is the type of films you do. Because there are some commercial actors like Tom Cruise, Will Smith, that are considered great actors, but they're really like movie stars. Cary Grant. They're not top tier actors, but they're in a lot of big budget or historical films or popular films. And if you're someone that just watches those type of movies and they're the stars of it, then you're going to think those are like, the greatest actors or your favorite actors. For me, I kind of like showy films, so I love like Jack Nicholson and James Cagney, Humphrey Bogart. But I think the more I watch or rewatch films like this, The Seventh Seal, I think Van Sydow is going to rise up that chart. And obviously, as I get into more Kurosawa films, I've seen a lot of them, but as I rewatch them, Toshiro Mifune is going to rise up that list as well. Actors that are in again, great films that are worth examining, worth deep diving into, and that have nuanced performances that elevate the films as well. They're not just along for the ride. I love how little dialogue is in this movie to start it. It helps with my commentary, so I'm not talking over anything or anyone. So this film was directed by William Friedkin, an interesting guy. Listening to a lot of what he said in the behind the scenes footage and audio commentary. Definitely a man of his time. Would absolutely be canceled for some of his things he said and his stances today, which is kind of weird to say because I think he directed films up until the last year of his life, which was this year, or at least something I think he directed was released this year. This year meaning 2023. I think August or so he died. I can Google it, but I think sometime over this summer he died. And I'm recording this November 14. I love him, but some of the things he said is just wild. The way he would talk about other films or his actors or women or people in general, um, hilarious. But yeah, definitely not a lot of stuff that would fly in today's culture. Great filmmaker though, great filmmaker, especially the way you hear him talk about um, his approach to filmmaking and the lengths he would go to accomplish the certain things he wanted to accomplish. Physically assaulting an actor, um, degrading women based on their looks, like I don't know, hugely entertaining. But again, not a lot of stuff that would fly in today's culture. But in looking at IMDb, like his top four films they list here as To Live and Die in LA, The Exorcist, French Connection, Killer Joe. I've seen all four of those movies. I love all four. But probably with the format of this show, the only other film that I would probably cover of his is The French Connection, which I think he did before this, a couple years. Great film. Great film. Definitely plan on covering it at some point on the podcast and doing it on commentary track as well for it. I love time capsule shots like this, where you just see the 70s, just how things look so different than they do now. Different, but the same. So I did hear Friedkin talk about that scene meaning a lot to him, because it does come back when Reagan is possessed. I think that he hears that voice coming from the demon in Reagan's body. And so this was supposed to be like foreshadowing of that as well. So this is based on a book. And what do I remember about the book? I do know he worked with the author closely on this. And it was a boy instead of a girl. And there was promise that they wouldn't reveal any of the names and things like that. But this is one of the rare cases where I don't think there was a lot of pushback on changes or quality when transferring from book to screen. This actor here, evidently a lot of people wanted this role. And I guess in the 70s, that was a big thing, like prestige roles. I know a lot of people wanted to be, a lot of actors wanted to be in Marlon Brando's role in The Godfather, another great movie made in the 70s. I think they wanted James Cagney, Orson Welles. I think like this, all the same names, Jack Nicholson, all the big names at the time, I think either wanted it or the producers wanted them for the role. Um, I think the same thing with here. A lot of big actors wanted to be in this movie, but Friedkin wanted an unknown actor. And I think this guy, he was doing some kind of stage play, and Friedkin thought he'd be a good fit for it. It's always interesting with older movies like this, where it's a great movie, but you look back and you think, man, like I've never heard of this actor before or since, and it's such a great movie. And then you hear about like an actor that you it's a legendary actor that you've always heard of and possibly still making films today, and you're like, man, it would have been interesting to see that actor in this film. Like for instance, like Jack Nicholson. It would have been interesting for Jack Nicholson to be in this film because previously mentioned, Jack Nicholson's in The Shining, which is my favorite horror film, and this might be number two or top 10 or top five. And it would have been interesting to say historically, oh wow, like a legacy actor like Jack Nicholson was in one of the greatest films that ever was made. But I do get where Freakin' is coming from, is in that sometimes you don't want a star in it. You want someone that's just known for this role, at least going into it. Obviously, if they become a star later, that's another thing. But you sometimes you just want to see the character and you don't want to see the actor in a particular role. This is one of the luxury of 70s filmmaking, is that you do get to take a lot of time in setting up your story. I think for Friedkin, I think it was either the original screenwriter or the author himself wrote the original screenplay, and Friedkin didn't like it because it was written as a horror movie with a bunch of scares and stuff. And from Friedkin's point of view, he was just making a movie. He wasn't making a horror movie. It was more like a documentary. And it's interesting that he did it that way because a lot of Exorcist movies now are pseudo documentaries where it's, found footage or meant to be real. Yeah, and if you look at this, it doesn't really have a ton of horror elements to it to start. Obviously, you have the Ouija board and you have the demon stuff at the beginning, but there aren't a lot of scares here. It's just a bunch of character stuff for the most part. And just as I say that, something supernatural kind of happens. So, unbeknownst to Ellen Burstyn, Captain Howdy is the demon. It's funny that Captain Howdy doesn't think her mother's pretty. Speaking of William Friedkin, he said he wanted someone as plain as a shopping cart for this movie when he was pushed on. I think they were like actresses like Farrah Fawcett and like a lot of the pretty young actresses of the day they wanted for this role. But he just wanted like an average looking woman for the part. He didn't want like a pretty movie star. And not only that, but I think he told Burstyn that he was going to New York or going somewhere to meet up with an actress that the studio wanted for the film. But he ended up seeing that actress in the supermarket or grocery store, or whatever, coincidentally. And I think he didn't even acknowledge that he saw her, but she looked so plain that he didn't want her for the role. And Burstyn was like, you could have seen me there and I would have looked plain. He was like, well, I didn't. So the role is yours if you want it. But it's always interesting with roles that actors are defined for and how they end up getting it. Even someone like myself who casts obviously much lower scale horror films. It's always interesting, like those sliding doors of like how you end up casting someone and how much it may mean to them or not mean to them, and how much thought or effort you put into it may not even be that much, but it affects their lives a lot. Even going beyond that, like I have a job where I do hire people, And it's tough when you're hiring and firing people because you affect their lives greatly. But for you, sometimes it's just like a flip of the coin. But it is interesting. Like I said, maybe because I have that perspective, because I also cast movies. Like I said, because I also have a job where I'm constantly, having to hire people and judge their performance and potentially let them go. You have a huge effect on them, their career, their lives, how they make a living. I definitely empathize and sympathize, and I also find it funny to hear his process and the process of a lot of people who do stuff like this. And again, it's more interesting to see it obviously on a much higher scale than this, where it has a lot more impact on people's lives. But yeah, in terms of the cast, so Ellen Burstyn, I think the only other thing like I really know her from was Requiem for a Dream, which obviously she was much older in life when she did that. I think that was like almost 30 years later that she did that did that film. But that was another great film she was in. But she's an actress that had a pretty long career though. It's funny when you watch this film and you see certain beats or tropes that are taken from this film to other horror films and even more directly other haunted house films or exorcist films. And you see how it's executed here. And one, you see how unoriginal some of the follow-ups are, and also how poorly executed some of the follow-ups are. A film that I notoriously don't like, for anyone that's listened to my podcast or any of my reviews, is Paranormal Activity. And it's such a cheesy ripoff of this with the acting and just the execution, and to see it here done so much better is just, it just emphasizes it even more. But another thing Paranormal Activity took from this film, and one thing that this film did really well, is the marketing. It marketed as "Don't watch this film," you know, and a lot of the marketing was people who saw the film and their reactions to it. And that's a brilliant thing for a horror movie. It's to, make it seem like this is too scary to watch. You're going to faint, you're going to pass out, you're going to be traumatized. Well, I thought Paranormal Activity was a joke. It was almost like a social experiment of like how bad can a movie be and still like have this weird social dynamic where if enough people claim they like it, like how many other people are gonna, like the Emperor's New Clothes, it's like how many people are gonna pretend like this thing is actually good if other people are saying it's good, that weird kind of social thing where you just go along with the group. But yeah, this had great marketing. Again, that, like I said, that was reused. And good for Paranormal Activity for reusing it. I think other horror films should have used this marketing strategy. The first jump scare of the movie didn't really add anything, honestly. I could see why Friedkin wanted to take a lot of that stuff out of the film, because that's what he talked about in going over the script, is taking a lot of this stuff out. Some of the scenes that were cut that's not in either version of the film was more of the buildup of Regan's health. A lot of the early scenes about her visiting the doctor. And it's interesting with this scene here because a lot of things get lost in time, and certain like advertising suddenly becomes reality. Like it's one of those things, if you keep saying something, it just becomes true. A lot of the success of this movie, again, was due to great marketing on how scary this movie is. But honestly, when you hear about people from that time that aren't buying into the propaganda, a lot of what made people watch this movie is the idea of seeing a little girl curse. It's like, yeah, it's a great film. Yeah, it's great marketing. Yeah, it's great performances. Yeah, it's an all-time classic. But why does this movie make a lot of money and The Shining doesn't, or like other great movies do or don't? A lot of times it's the marketing. Like a good or bad film is great for posterity. Maybe it'll add to rewatches or make people think it's a classic years and years down the line. It'll have that longevity. But a lot of times what makes a film like really good or not is getting people to get off their butts and go to the theaters. And a lot of what made people get off their butt and go to the theaters wasn't any of the quality aspects of the movie, but just the fact that it was hilarious to see this little girl cursing and saying all these vulgar things. Um, so that had a lot to do with the success of this film as well. Yeah, Friedkin was talking about these sequences here, and it's all about like rising and falling, rising up to heaven, going down to hell type thing with the mother and just with a lot of his visions. This was evidently one of the more scarier scenes in the film, and I can see why. It's more real. It's none of that fantasy like horror movie stuff. It's just like watching an actual surgery. Obviously, stuff you can do now, but at the time, like seeing stuff like this, I guess would be more freaky in the 70s. And now we can just go on Twitter or YouTube and just see videos of like actual surgeries. Just seeing that blood squirt out of her neck. That's a lot. It took about almost an hour into the movie before things got really weird, but damn, that was a hell of a scene. That's crazy. I think that scene was not in the original. I believe in the book, who put the cross under the pillow was a bigger issue than it ends up being in the movie. And this character here was, I believe, the inspiration for Columbo, or that's how the story goes. In that the writer for The Exorcist and the writer for this movie as well was pitching a series. William Peter Blatty was pitching a series for this particular character, this detective character, to have his own show. And then Columbo ended up popping up as an extremely similar character that walked around in a raincoat, faked Alzheimer's, pretended he wasn't very smart, and then would figure everything out at the end. So it's a lot of similarities. Coincidence, plagiarism, who knows? But yeah, there were similar projects out at the same time for this detective character to have his own show. So in this, he kind of figures out that Reagan killed the guy, and he's trying to make the mother admit it, but in reality, he's thinking like, am I going to really convict a little girl? Where's that going to go? But that's a subtext for a lot of what's going on in this scene, according to Friedkin. This sequence seems straight out of an episode of Columbo. It's hard to believe they didn't sue, or he didn't sue Blatty. That is one of the most iconic shots of the film. That, and of course, the peas shooting out of her mouth. It's not, I'm not a big fan of it. I'm not a big fan of that and the shot earlier where her neck was plunging out, because this film seems to steep itself in realism. Just the way it's shot, the documentary style, uh, toning down a lot of the horror elements just to make it seem like real characters. The pacing of it is just so slow, so much buildup. You can say it earns moments like that where the supernatural stuff does come out, but I would prefer it's just stuck with the realism and maybe like just stayed with what actually, if you believe what actually happened with the little boy, where it's just a kid acting possessed, where there's no actual supernatural stuff going on. So then it's up to you to interpret it as, is this supernatural? Is this all in the kid's head? Is this group hysteria? Like really question what's going on. When you see the head completely spinning around and her neck almost plunging out like a frog's neck, there's no gray area there. This is 100% supernatural. And I prefer that area of gray and realism that it seemed like 95% of the film is aiming for, except for those shots. But then again, those shots are the iconic shots. That's what people remember about this movie, is the kid cursing, the peas, the head spinning, and of course her masturbating with a Jesus cross. So that was the voice of the guy he met before earlier in the film. And that's just a demon trying to mess with his head. Or it's his own imagination and he's going crazy. Which again is kind of why I wanted it to be a little bit more ambiguous and not all out. She's 100% possessed. But what the hell do I know? This is one of the most successful horror movies ever made. Again, this gets into more of his mental state. Is he projecting that the demon knows these things, or did the demon actually know these things about his personal life? His mother dying and the interaction with the bum and the subway station. I understand this character is supposed to have doubt. That's the way these stories work. But how the hell do you leave that room and say because it's tap water, you don't think she's possessed? That is pretty fucking scary. Again, while I prefer this movie stay more steeped in the reality it established, when it does go supernatural, it really executes it well. All the stuff it says messing with the priest's head, the pea soup, the help me, the head spin, the levitating, it's just a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of great visuals. The iconic shot, followed by another iconic shot, and another iconic shot. Will they stop feeding her pea soup? You would think it'd be a smoke machine or something, or obviously CGI could do it today, but they had to have this room freezing cold to get the cold breath from their mouths. He's just a body filled with like pea soup instead of blood. Oh, not the next thing again. That's pretty cool. I love the fact that there's no music for a lot of this stuff too. It just lets the scene stand on its own. Iconic shot, iconic dialogue. Another great shot. A lot of great shots in this movie. Wait a minute, wasn't her hands just free? And she was floating over the bed? Now her hands are tied up again? How did that happen? Was there a time lapse there that I didn't notice? Or was that just a weird edit to insert that shot? Because if it was a time lapse, like why are they where they were before the jump? Here's where that foreshadowing before pays off. Why does the demon love effing with this guy so much? I love the breaks between the action, the quiet moments here. Obviously, they don't have the visuals and the excitement as the action, but I think it adds a lot. Rather than just going straight to an all-out climax of just like nonstop sensory overload. These quiet moments enhance when the big moments happen. This was super unexpected the first time I saw it. The way she's just casually watching him. And he dies off screen. She's no longer tied up to the bed. I know Friedkin was worried at this point, like, would he lose the audience having one of his main characters just beating up a little girl? But he had hoped, and I think he did succeed in the audience realizing that he's beating up the demon and not a little girl. This is a true horror scene right here. I think Friedkin was getting upset in this scene that he wasn't getting the performance he wanted. Then he smacked the actor, then had him do this. I think it was for this take right here. He got smacked right before he did it. Must be an odd feeling. There's elation that your daughter's safe, but also There must be some kind of guilt there for how many people had to die to save her. The one thing I didn't like about this ending is that all her scars are gone. I mean, it's one thing for the possession to be gone, but I just felt like she should have been at least had a little bit more scar makeup on. Just a few light scratches, but there should be some wounds there. It's always odd with these type of movies where you have multiple lead characters and you're just kind of following the story because essentially these are side characters in a way, but they're the ones that are wrapping up the film. Even if you want to view Reagan as the main character, she doesn't really have much of like a wrap up to her story. I mean, she's better. We don't see her get better. We just hear the mother say she gets better. And then the mother kind of disappears for a lot of the climax as well. She's hardly there. So it's an odd movie in a way. That was it, man. It's still a classic. Definitely not better than The Shining in my eyes, but this movie was great. Awesome. Loved it. Well told. So much iconic scenes, shots, dialogue. All-time classic. Definitely top 10, maybe top 5, even possibly 2 or 3 on my list of favorite horror films. I'd really have to think about it. Having just seen it, hard to commit, but highly recommend. Awesome movie.